Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Ariane, I'll kick it off to you.
Great, thanks, Izzy. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining our, Brand Innovators sort of fireside chat today. I'm very excited to be joined with Kimberly today. I think what we'll do is we'll just do a short round of intros, and then I have a couple of different questions for Kimberly. But I think it'll be a great conversation. And as always, if you guys have any questions, just feel free to drop them into the chat, and we will, try to answer and leave some time at the end to answer them. So just to sort of get started, my name is Ariane Turley, and I'm the lead industry consultant for retail and CPG brands at SimilarWeb. And what SimilarWeb does is we're essentially a platform that is the measure of the digital world. So we look at everything from brand site traffic to where that traffic is coming from, to sort of how do you optimize your digital strategy. But really the star of today's show is Kimberly. So I'm very excited to be here today with her, who's a global marketing leader. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So I won't say too much up front because I know you've got a ton of questions. But first of all, Ariane, SimilarWeb, thank you for having me. Thank you, Brand Innovators. So I've been at Kimberly-Clark now for about 2.5 years. B2B marketing. So I'll talk about B2B versus B2C, which is my background. And I lead the skincare portfolio. Skincare is soap, sanitizer, lotion, hand and body wash, along with hair products as well. So I came from PepsiCo. That's where I grew up as a marketer. I was there for 9 years, worked across several different brands, innovation, Amp Energy, which is one of PepsiCo's energy brands. Now they have a few. Brisk Tea, which is one of PepsiCo's billion-dollar brands. So I had the opportunity to do a lot of really cool things there. And then my last role before leaving was overseeing marketing for Georgia and the Carolinas, which are very important markets for us in a regional capacity. So I went from national to regional.
Cool.
And I'm excited to be here today.
Well, I'm excited to have you too. So I think one of the first things, we sort of wanted to talk about, I think when Kimberly and I met before, I thought there were really 3 key themes that came out of our conversation. I think one of the things that was interesting is talking about sort of differences in B2B versus B2C marketing. And obviously when you were at PepsiCo, you had sort of more of a direct-to-consumer bent, or sort of a business-to-consumer bent, but at Kimberly-Clark, your audience is a little bit different. So can you just give us sort of an overview of what do you think are the biggest differences between B2B and B2C marketing?
Absolutely. So the core is very similar. You've got your brand guardrails, your brand architecture, key things that guide you as a brand. However, how they come to life are very different. B2B, you're not talking to the end user. You're talking to not the business, but different people within the business making decisions. So it varies by segment. And by segments, I mean healthcare versus industrial versus offices versus education facilities. And so the chooser is very different. For healthcare facilities, you may be talking to a facility manager in one piece of the business who is purchasing for the waiting rooms, and then you may be talking to more of a chemical person that is purchasing for back of the house, meaning soaps that nurses and doctors need to use before operations, and that varies for industrial as well. Whereas with that, in the B2B world, you are crafting a story, a narrative that is rooted in the end user insight, but also has to sell and be attractive to that chooser. And so it's a lot more of a price conscious market as well, because this purchaser is also purchasing for everything from potentially the copy paper in the building to managing that same budget for repairs that need to be done. So it's a very different conversation than when you think about B2C. When I'm talking directly to you, Ariane, and you're walking down a aisle at Kroger, and the packaging speaks to you. Packaging isn't as big of an issue. We still want it to look nice on the B2B side, but it's going to be in the stock room, right? Mm-hmm. So it needs to look nice, because if we're going to sell it on Amazon or on retail channels, which has exploded with COVID, it matters a lot there, but it's just not the same rigor. So we're not doing packaging studies to make sure it pops on shelf or any of those really fun things that you'll do on the consumer side. You're more so, doing testing to make sure that the message resonates with that chooser, in addition to the end user. So lots of simultaneous research being done when you do come up with the positioning. B2B as well, a lot more. I would say the brand has to be a lot more analytically minded. So B2C, I managed very large budgets, and I was aware of the numbers, the analytics, but I did not own the P&L. At Pepsi, the finance team owns the P&L. So this was my first experience with that at Kimberly-Clark, and not just owning it, but really having to make decisions based off of that and working from a global perspective with the regions to make those decisions, because it's really up to them as to whether they want to take an innovation or not, because they own their P&L and they have to answer for their performance at the end of the day. Versus so those are a few of the differences. So it was a lot. I say that my B2B experience these past 2 years has been my version of an MBA.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine. It sounds like now you're not just responsible for marketing, but sort of more of like the P&L and all hands on sort of, it's a little bit more, touching a lot of different sides of the business. And I guess, yeah, I can imagine that that's been a challenge. And I think that sort of brings me into one of my other questions is like, and I think you spoke about this a little bit, but, how do you think these KPIs have shifted, right? So when you're on, what were your KPIs at Pepsi, and then how are your KPIs at Kimberly-Clark, and sort of how have those differed and changed?
Yeah. Excellent question. So on the B2C side, you can plethora of KPIs. So from your engagement KPIs, how are people interacting with your brand? And then you have your volume KPIs. But on the B2B side, a lot more rigor around KPIs and the bottom line. Whereas, to be honest with you, and I don't know if maybe I wasn't in the position at Pepsi to care as much about this, but we were looking at top line. It was all about volume. We weren't talking about the profit. I'm sure the finance team was somewhere talking about that, but on the B2B world, in the B2B world that I'm in, it's all about how profitable something is going to be, and our margins are top of mind for everything. And when you think about it, and the fact that it's not as much of a volume play as per se a Pepsi was. So people are drinking sodas all the time, right? The rate at which people go to the restroom and consume soaps and lotions and sanitizers, unfortunately, pre-COVID was very low. People did not wash their hands. Now we're,
fun fact.
Yeah, fun fact. I'm sure many of you are not surprised by that, but because I think we've all walked out of a restroom, right, and said that person didn't wash their hands. Well, it happens around the world. In the US, we're better than a lot of other places, which is scary to say. But on the B2B side, we have guardrails around the margin the product needs to meet from an innovation perspective before that can launch, because it just doesn't make sense to launch anything that's not going to be profitable. So that's really how they differ. And then also, we don't have any social media, KPIs, right? Like, people aren't necessarily saying, oh, let me go follow. And keep in mind, Kleenex soap that goes in your bathroom at work, very different from the consumer Kleenex, nose facial tissue, right? So people might care about that and want to go follow that brand and engage with them. But consumers are not looking for the brands that they see at work. So it's just very different all around, way more analytical, still fun in a different way. You're stretching a different area of your brain. And I would tell anybody looking to take more of a general management path, or be a CMO, like, you definitely want to get the B2B experience under your belt to truly round out how you think about things.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think sort of what you're saying makes sense too, right? Because at Pepsi, like, ultimately you're selling to the person who's buying Pepsi, who's also the person who's drinking it. But that's obviously not the case when you're at a B2C role or B2B role, right? Like, even though I use like Kleenex at work, I'm not the one who's making that decision. I just sort of am given have what's there.
And people aren't, I mean, at the end of the day, if you go to work and your soap is not coming out, or it's not the consistency that you ideally like, you're not going to complain because you're at work,
Yeah.
you're going back to your desk, you've got other things going on. When you are at home and you're sipping on your Pepsi or your Mountain Dew, if the flavor is off, it's a whole different thing. So it's a totally different level of brand engagement and brand loyalty.
Right. No, that makes sense. I think something else, and this is sort of what you're saying about how in your current role, your B2B role, it's a lot more analytical. And obviously SimilarWeb, it's a data company. I love talking about data. So I'm a little bit curious, can you talk a little bit more about that as sort of like, how do you use data to inform your strategy?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the B2C side. So at Pepsi, we had Nielsen's IRI tool, which is wonderful, syndicated data. They're going to restate the data. So, every week, 2 weeks, it's changing, it's being updated, and it's pretty spot on because they are getting data from the largest retailers, right? And they're able to model out retailers that they don't have to really get you to a pretty good estimation of how you're doing as a company, how all of your line items are doing, SKUs versus your competition. So I definitely took for granted the IRI data and how easy that was when I was at Pepsi to then take that and pair with our internal. We looked at bottler case sales at Pepsi. So your internal data and then, your financials to look at a full story. On the B2B side, we have found that precision data is the best for us. Now, precision is interesting because they work with a few large distributors, but there are millions of distributors that distribute products that we sell to as a company, that Georgia Pacific, our competitor, that SD Torque, that Gojo Perel are selling to, that, they're not selling their data. They just have no interest in selling their data. They're niche. A lot of these distributors pre-COVID focused in on certain channel segments we use interchangeably. So you have distributors that or just healthcare. You have distributors that are simply offices, which has changed with COVID as well. It's a lot more omni-channel now. But that being said, this precision data, they are really using their best guesses and the limited amount of hard data that they have. And so when I got to Kimberly-Clark, I was amazed to know that. So I started in 2018. The last time they bought data was 2016. And, it was, hey, things don't change that regularly now. So that regularly for us. So there's no reason to purchase, and it informs the strategy, but it's not nearly as critical of a piece of the strategy as it is on, fast moving B2C volume SKUs. So this precision data is great. We use it to directionally tell us what we need to do from a strategic standpoint. But it's not the same because I have to solely rely on my internal data. So internally, I'm looking at what SKUs are moving the fastest. I can kind of cross-reference to see in what channels those are moving and why, but it's not the same as having that lens of what's taking place in the market as well, like I had with IRI. In addition to that, pricing from IRI was awesome. We have to do a separate pricing study to look at how we're priced versus the market. On skincare, because skincare only became a big deal with the pandemic, we really didn't even have a skincare team prior to COVID. This is a totally new role that I'm in. So we just did a pricing study. We never knew how we were priced versus our competitors. So it's just been a very different world being over here on B2B, but it makes you a lot more gritty, I would say. And the data that you do have, you're using it, you're modeling it. My investment banking skills have come into play here a lot, which was my life before marketing. But so those are a few of the differences in how we use data. So at B2B, very reliant on our internal data, the precision data, and then also distributor sales data, and then also demand gen, looking at that. So we use Salesforce. We actually take a lot of those insights of what people are searching for, what they're looking for, and incorporate that into our strategy as well.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And I think that's something I do a lot at SimilarWeb too, right? Is trying to figure out, okay, what are people searching for? How does that inform? And, going back to brands and helping them understand, like, searches for like antibacterial soap or something have really increased in the last like year. Yeah.
Exactly. What is antibacterial versus, and so leveraging those insights to create materials for our customers to help them educate their end users. So, a lot of the times if you go into, let's say, a restroom at a hospital and you see on the wall, this is why you should wash your hands, or those sheets. We do a lot of taking from national sources like the CDC and the WHO, incorporating our research and analytics into it from different studies and creating those for our partners so that they don't have to do that. So that's one of the added value things that we do that I actually love being on the B2B side.
Yeah, no, that sounds super interesting, and definitely is like a whole different beast. But it seems like B2B, they're slowly moving more to join the D2C side and learning about different data sets.
COVID has sped up.
Exactly. They all of a sudden they're like, oh, maybe we should think about our digital strategy a little bit more.
Maybe we should do more with our demand gen offering that. Maybe we should. So it's been great, and like to be in the space and to be talking about, okay, what KPIs do we set? How many accounts do we care that we won, lost, converted? But then also churn is a big number for us that we're always paying attention to. And so it's all about bundling programs. So it's like I said, totally different muscle that you use on the B2B side. And so I would say to anybody, if you're interested in marketing and you consider yourself to be more analytical than creative, B2B would be a great place for you because you still get that creative. It's just different. But then also on the B2B side, and I don't know about all companies, but only Kimberly-Clark, we don't use agencies. We do it all ourselves.
Wow.
Yeah. So, the blessing and a curse, you can look at it either way. I think that there's a huge advantage to having, and we use more agencies on the testing side of things, right, and the analytics, but from a creative standpoint, it's like, our internal creative teams are like, okay, what's the brief? What do you need me to do? And it's cool, but I think you definitely miss that outside perspective of people looking across industries and things that are going on. So there's a lot of opportunity for the B2B space to grow.
Definitely. I think something else, and you've kind of alluded to this, that one of the other themes I think that's really come out is you've worked in marketing on both a regional level, or not both, but on a regional level, a national level, as well as sort of a global level, right? And so I think it'd be really interesting to hear about the differences between each of those. And maybe we can start with discussing your transition from regional to national, and sort of how do you, change gears there?
Yeah, so I actually went from national to regional.
Oh, interesting.
Global. So I will talk about going from a national role to a regional role because it was very interesting, and one that I had not thought much about until I actually got there, and the shock of what I was being faced with. And I'll also say before I get into this that I want to encourage anyone listening to this, thinking about a move, thinking about something that may not make sense, because I will tell you, I had a lot of people say, Kim, you're already at headquarters, you're working on the brand side, don't take a regional role. Why would you do that? That's going backwards. People start in the region to get to where we are, which I totally understood. A few things, I believed in myself to go there, do a great job, and to make a story out of it that would be different from the story I was doing at the national brand level. Two, you follow your leader. People don't leave companies, right? They leave managers for the most part. I had a wonderful leader that I was going to work for in the region. His name was John Shoemate. I highly suggest you follow him on LinkedIn and on social. He does a wonderful job of posting very inspirational stuff. And if you connect with him, he's always happy to talk. He's just, really demonstrated what servant leadership is for me. And I went there, and under his leadership, I just really flourished. I was able to, he gave me the flexibility and the freedom to build programs as I would in New York. And I'd say, John, I don't have the budget for this. I'm going to call somebody in New York on the brand side I used to work with, and he's like, go for it, do whatever you need to do. And so I just got to be really scrappy. And so how the roles are different, to answer your question, at the national level, you're doing a lot of pulling stuff. You've got your markets broken out into different, stronghold markets versus weak versus battleground markets. And you're building a national program that's based in the inside of whatever you're trying to do. At the national level, you may say, this year, we're going to target our battleground markets, leave our strongholds alone. They're doing totally fine. And that kind of leaves those stronghold markets without anything that they can particularly leverage for their purpose. They can still leverage the national plan, but it wasn't made for them, right? Versus at the regional level, when you're just taking what you're given and being on the other side of that, you have to leverage those assets and then figure out locally what you need to add in. Which, I had an awesome boss, and I'd say, okay, well, Mountain Dew is a great asset, and I'm appreciative to have this, national basketball star, because Mountain Dew is sponsoring basketball. But that's not going to resonate here in Atlanta. People want a Hawks player. People want a Falcons player, right? So I was able to go out and locally sign those people and then use them and their likeness for programs that honestly moved volume, because we were then able to create dealer loader programs and account specific programs for the racetracks, the Walmarts, the Krogers of the world, leveraging these local assets for not just the in-store static cleans and things like that, but I could say, Kroger, let's do a promotion with all the stores in Georgia. The stores that win are going to get an appearance from Devontae Freeman, who was the star of the Super Bowl the year that the Falcons went, right? And so like those things are what you have to do on a regional level. You can't just take what national is going to give you, like you leverage that to take it to the next level. And so that was the freedom that I loved from being in the region. But to be honest, I think it worked out for me that I came from national into regional. And so I would encourage anybody doing it the opposite to try your best to understand the national level. So if you're in a regional capacity and you're looking to go to the national level, do yourself a favor and look at, the programming, the information that you're being given, and just take a second to say, okay, what inspired this? Where did this come from? I wonder what were the insights that guided this. Once you come up with that framework of questions, I, encourage you to then go to your national team and talk about that, to see if you can go and spend a day or two there with somebody that is on the national brand or strategy team to better learn how that is, because it's only gonna better inform what you're doing, because national and regional, they work hand in hand together. And I know that being at Kimberly-Clark now in global and having had both those experiences, I'm a much better marketer because of the way I think. And it prepared me to take on the global lens, which is a completely different beast.
I'm sure. I mean, I think that makes sense, right? It sounds like, at the regional level, you have a little bit more creativity. You can, it's a little bit more sort of you're on the ground, and so you understand what's needed, but obviously it can always be challenging, right? To be like, well, like convince national that this is necessary because they think they know. And so it's good to be able to speak both languages, I guess.
It is. And I was really very fortunate in that if Mountain Dew hadn't had the NBA as a property, or if Gatorade didn't have in an NFL, then it would have been much harder to get assets and to tell the story, right? So, that's a totally different ball game if your, national team just isn't doing anything that's going to help you locally. But then on the same time, it's really exciting because then you have full flexibility and you don't have to stay within any guardrails, right?
No, definitely. Now, I guess I'm curious, how did you transition from regional to all of a sudden going to a global role? And, how did you begin to understand what the different global needs were?
Absolutely. So excellent question. One thing I learned at Pepsi is selling. That regional role really got me close to crafting your narrative based on what that customer wants to hear. So I'm going to give a very different pitch and story to Walmart versus to 7-Eleven, right?
Hmm.
And so when I took a look at my career and I thought about where I wanted to go next to really round out my skill set, I said, well, I haven't done global. I need to try that out. Did 6 years in national, 4 years in region, and then now 2.5 years in the global capacity. And what I did was I looked at the role and I made a gram of how my skill sets transferred. And I used real examples in my interview of things that I'd done nationally, regionally, and how I envisioned them coming to life on a global scale.
Wow.
And I practiced that. I did, of course, a ton of research on marketing, global marketing, and what that looked like. And, to understand before I went into the interview that when you say global, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm looking for one strategy that's going to work in EMEA, APAC, LAO, and North America. It could mean, and it does for me, and it did on bath tissue as well, which was the role I had before this at Kimberly-Clark. You're going to target focus markets within the region because Asia is so different. China and their needs are different within country. Hong Kong is very different. I'll give this example. In EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa, when you're looking at toilet tissue needs in Germany, for them, 3-ply and 4-ply is like baseline. Like they hear 2-ply and 1-ply, and they're appalled that that is what we use here in the US and like other places in Europe. And I mean, so on the B2B side with toilet tissue, typically it's much thinner, the toilet tissue at work, right? You're like, okay, I can think about this. You're not going to use it at home. In Europe, it's the same thing. Like that would just when my colleagues in Europe, would come over pre-COVID they'd always just say, I forgot to pack my toilet tissue, because it's just so different here. And so, but that's Germany in Europe. The UK and a few other places, it's like us. It's totally fine. So, you have to zone in on focus markets based on the opportunity for growth, based on your opportunity for growth, like how saturated are you in the market, what is your brand equity score, all of that stuff to figure out what your focus markets need to be from a global perspective. And so having that understanding from like my research and then having talked to people that were in global roles to help me solidify the fact that I did want to take this leap in global, I also knew the why. I was able to talk in that interview about how global would help me reach my end goal, which at the time, it was to be like a CMO, GM. I don't know what I want now. It changes every other day. But and to talk about how that regional and those national experiences would only help me better help them in their global marketing efforts. And
Definitely.
so, don't discredit your experience if it's only been local and you've only had experience in Atlanta or in Chicago. It's all about how you craft your story. I encourage you to practice that story with somebody whose feedback you trust, to give you the honest feedback of like what is going to make you a better person. Because I mean, I started at Kimberly-Clark in a senior manager capacity without any global experience, without any B2B experience, and those were like two of the 4 key things that were listed on the must-have requirements, right? Without an MBA. So don't count yourself out. It's all about how you sell yourself.
No, definitely. Well, it seems like they're really no, I think that makes sense. But I think it's interesting too. I mean, some of the things that you're describing at a global level, it does sort of seem similar to working at a national level in the sense of, different countries have different focus areas, but even here in the US, right, like different regions have different focus areas too. And so it's like, you could explain like, even though I don't know exactly like what's happening in Germany or France and you have to learn those on their jobs, you could explain at least like, well, I learned how the, Southeast was different than the Northeast, for example. So makes sense.
And then also you can explain how you take best practices from a region and you can nuance them after you've truly learned about the different pockets, and then with the other region, right? And how you create those synergies. And that's something that we've done a lot here at Kimberly-Clark, and something that, I was proud to do at Pepsi also.
Yeah, no, definitely. Seems like they're really living a life of luxury over there in Germany too, with their 3 and 4 ply.
They are. And I mean, the tissue, so it's good for us because those plies are way more margin accretive. But then also you use it up quicker. So
Yeah.
here you see big jumbo rolls, in a bathroom, whereas over there you're not going to get that. So it's
Yeah.
really nice. So
It's
that's a focus market for us.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. It is funny too, actually. I grew up in Hong Kong, and so when I think about office bathrooms in Hong Kong versus the US, you can really see how those are different too.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Hong Kong, they have different formats of tissue that we don't even have here in the US.
Right.
So like the
Right.
center pool and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. The folds anyway. I feel
And
like
people in the US hate folded tissue, okay? Like they think they're using a napkin, whereas in Asia, particularly most of Asia, that's totally accepted. It's, totally fine. So, but yeah, some really fun insights that we can talk
yeah,
about with Hong Kong
I'm sure.
the world.
That is fun. You've learned a lot about sort of the global tissue needs, and I'm sure now global soap needs, as we are in a global pandemic. So I'm sure that's also changed a lot.
It has, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of, what do you think is the biggest thing you've learned during the pandemic, sort of with transitioning into sort of the skincare category? Like what do you think has been your biggest takeaway there?
I would have to say, you have to be able to be flexible for the unexpected. And, where we as a company didn't do a good job was not thinking about skincare and a few other categories that did not matter that much pre-pandemic. And so when the pandemic happened, I mean, we were out of stock for months. We still had our best year ever.
Wow.
But can you only imagine what that would have looked like if we'd actually had a supply chain that was appropriately equipped to manage the business and any growth that we saw? Similar with bath tissue, people probably remember the run on bath tissue. And so, that has really changed the way we as a company plan. And I think I'm sure it's all companies, but for us commoditized industries, really just, taking the lead, locking in features for pulp, for the ingredients that go into skincare, your alcohol and different things, to make sure that that doesn't happen again. As far as the innovation perspective, looking to figure out, well, how do you make skincare last more than 2 years, which is already what we thought was long. But for companies that ordered in March when the pandemic first happened and didn't open back up until this past March or so, it's already a year gone. So it's think very differently about go to market, innovation, and our positioning in the world, and really who we want to be in this wellness space. And so we're working a lot closer with our consumer business, because they make soap, but for you to use at home, and bath tissue for use at home. And with people spending so much time at home over the pandemic, and then also with the fear that people have of going back into the office, even though people have been vaccinated and everything. This year's just put people into a shock. And so it's, well, how do we level up our products to make people feel even more at home when they're in the office? So that has been the biggest takeaway. Along with having an appropriately staffed team. I think that Kimberly-Clark, like a lot of companies, we're very lean. Bare bones, most people are probably doing 2 jobs at a minimum, but that all breaks when you go into a pandemic. So
no, definitely. And I think a lot of people have learned a lot from this last year, so that really makes sense. So we just have just about 5 minutes left, and so I think I want to get a little bit more personal. So just wanted to hear a little bit more about sort of, I know something you really have talked about a lot is your path to marketing was a bit untraditional. And can you sort of tell us a little bit about how you got into marketing, and then what advice would you give someone who's looking to pivot into marketing, who doesn't necessarily come from marketing background?
Thank you for this question because it's very personal to me, and I love telling the story whenever I can. So I was an economics major, went to Spelman College, knew I wanted to do investment banking. Afterwards, did not enjoy it over the summers, but still did it because I didn't know what else to do. We didn't have social media and LinkedIn and all of that stuff back then to really, I would say, plug yourself into different opportunities. So for me, I went into banking, sales and trading. And a year in, I just knew for sure that I was not going to make it another day. Instead of quitting because I needed to support myself, I just took the stance of figuring out people to meet with. I reached out to every mentor type of person I ever had met in life, which, now it's even easier, right? You look somebody up on LinkedIn and you see that they're doing something you think you would be interested in. You shoot them a note. The worst they can say is no. But back then it was, can we meet for coffee? Can we meet for lunch? Can we meet for dinner on the weekends, anytime? I mean, I was running around New York City, meeting with people to learn about their career paths, how they enjoyed it, why they enjoyed it, to make sure that it aligned to what I wanted to do. So I figured out that I had never heard of brand management. I learned about brand management from a mentor, Jerry DeVard. She told me all about her career. I talked to a few more people that she put me in touch with that I found on my own. And I was like, this is what I need to do. And the why is because it's marketing, but it's not just creative. There was an analytical piece. And so I would be able to sell my background in finance to them and the analytics versus, I couldn't go to like a creative agency because they'd be like,
Right.
what are you talking about?
Right.
And so with that, I was fortunate, interviewed with Pepsi. They said, okay, if you can, pass 3 trading license exams, you can probably figure this stuff out. And so I started at Pepsi. My boss from finance, when I told him I was leaving, he looked at me and he said, you're leaving to go sell soda? And, I said, well, it's not selling, I'm going to be creating strategies and all these different things.
Right.
He says, you're never going to make money like this again. If you go to marketing, you're never going to, like, what are you doing with your life? He literally said a lot of things that I could easily see scaring people to not do it. Right. But he told me, he said, if you don't like it, you've got a job back, like come back within a year and I'll, we'll figure it out. May not be this desk. We'll figure something out because I just don't want you to lose on this opportunity. So a few things there. Wherever you are now, just do your best. Do your best, even if you don't like it. Build relationships with people so that people care and are invested in you. Because the thing is, if you work in a regular company, what's easiest is transitioning within the company. Citigroup didn't really have a big marketing division and it was very top heavy. And I knew that it wasn't going to be looked well upon trying to do that within Citi. So I had to look outside. But if you're in a traditional company, I see it at Kimberly-Clark, I've seen it at Pepsi a ton. People go from finance into marketing and you may have to take a role back, but like that is the best and safest way to try something new. To that, I also say, a lot of people will say, oh, well, you want to do a career switch, you have to go to business school and do it. And that's certainly one way to do it. But you can also just find a job doing it. And, you may have to take a step back. I mean, I took a huge pay cut going from banking to marketing. But the savings came in that, well, I didn't go to business school and figured out what I wanted to do and was able to make this leap, right? So that is my path. And then once I got to Pepsi, really just grinding. And, I didn't have perfect reviews all the time, right? It was like strong in this area, needs help on the creative. So I'm like, okay, well, how do I work on the creative? And then I had a manager that was like, needs help on the analytics. And I was like, what? What's going on here? And so, it's never going to be a streamlined path, but I encourage anybody looking to transition into marketing to do your research, to talk to people, and to really figure out what part of marketing best suits you. Is it the creative? Is it the digital? Is it the e-commerce side? Like, what skills do you have now that will allow you to transition in?